just the facts, ma'am.
You mentioned writing books. Tell us a little bit about your book about Howard Zinn, who not everybody, especially some of our younger audience, may not be familiar with who he is.
Yeah, Howard Zinn was born in 1922. He died in 2010. He was recruited by the communists as a teenager growing up in Brooklyn in the 1930s, and became, as far as we know, an official member of the Communist Party USA. That's according to an analysis of his FBI files by Ron Radish, who himself had briefly been a member of the Communist Party and is a historian. So that's his background. He earned a PhD from Columbia University. While he was doing that, he was teaching Marxism at the Brooklyn Communist Party USA headquarters. And like many good communists, when he was given instructions to give up his official membership, he did so. That gave him the opportunity to teach at Spelman College, which was a small Christian school for Black women, actually started as a way to teach former slave women to read in Atlanta. And, a place where students were required to attend chapel every day, adhere to a curfew, dress code, and so forth. Well, Howard Zinn went there and he radicalized the students, ostensibly under the cover of promoting civil rights. He got fired after 7 years by the first Black and the first male president of the college for, quote, insubordination. But he soon landed on his feet at Boston University, and that's where he taught until he retired in 1988. Howard Zinn did not do any real teaching of history or political science, those subjects that he was entrusted to teach. He radicalized students. He didn't adhere to his job description of, assigning papers and tests. And, as you know, someone who teaches, all that work, it's quite time consuming and a lot of care is taken. But Howard Zinn was sort of a gadfly, sort of a Pied Piper for the youth. So in Atlanta, he was leading them on what he called civil rights demonstrations. And then at Boston University, it was against the Vietnam War. Howard Zinn was a propagandist. He was a propagandist for the communists, especially during the Vietnam War. And in the late 70s, he was asked to write a general U.S. history book, which he had published in 1980, and it's called A People's History of the United States. I don't know if people can see this, but it's very popular. And you can find it on the bookshelf at any Barnes & Noble, any university bookstore. It still remains in the top 100 selling books in history on Amazon. And that took off. It started off slowly. It had an initial printing of about 4,000. But it is a publishing phenomenon because it sells more copies each year as time goes on. Most books, you have your initial burst and then it plateaus and then it goes down. Well, that's not the case with Howard Zinn's book. And part of the reason for that is that it's used in the classroom and it's also been promoted in popular culture. But it's a very distorted communist version of American history. As a matter of fact, I compared it to a Communist Party leader's book called, that is supposed to be a, sort of a history of, the United States. It was written in 1951, and there are very many parallels between Zinn's book and William Z. Foster's book. And of course, in 1951 is when Howard Zinn was teaching Marxism at Brooklyn Party headquarters.
Yeah.
So it's a very distorted view of American history. It's intended to give, our form of government, our founding, our values a black eye, as communists, want. And and that's what Howard Zinn did very expertly, but he did it by updating the lingo. There's a lot of 1960s terminology about the man, the establishment.
I remember those days, unfortunately. And
Yeah.
tell us about what your response was to that, because I know you have a great book out on that.
Yeah, so this is, I wrote Debunking Howard Zinn, and that came out in August of 2019. And I was originally going to have that book done in 2011. I had a sort of a publishing agreement, but that fell through. And then fortunately, in 2017, I was contacted by someone and was able to write the book. When I set out to write Debunking Howard Zinn, I thought I would just be addressing these anti-American biases.
Mm-hmm.
But to my surprise, what I found was not only was Howard Zinn expressing his hatred for this country, but he was distorting sources to do so.
Mm-hmm.
He was also plagiarizing. He would selectively quote, using ellipses to leave out critical information, things that we would fail students for. That students, right?
Yes.
Plagiarize. I've had those cases where I've had to give students warnings. Usually where I taught, it was the first warning probably got noted in your record, but the second time you plagiarized, you could have been kicked out of college.
Right.
Well, Howard Zinn exceeds anything a college freshman ever did for a paper that I've assigned. He leaves out critical words that give the opposite impression of what his source, the author, intended. And he does this beginning with Christopher Columbus, which is when his book opens. And he plagiarizes from a book by Hans Koning. It's a little paperback, and it's intended for high school students. It's really a screed. Hans Koning was a anti-Vietnam War organizer, aligned. He was Zinn's friend, and he wasn't a historian. He was a novelist and a playwright, and he writes this book on Columbus. Howard Zinn plagiarizes from it, and it's all documented in my book. And Howard Zinn gets credit, and so he's cited, and people quote him and say, "Wow, I never knew this about Christopher Columbus. Wow, this is so revealing." and no one, before had noticed that these are just whole sentences, just lifted out of Hans Koning's book with a few phrases rearranged. And Howard Zinn passed it off as his own, quote, original research after reading extensively in the works of Columbus.
It's interesting because we have had, I grew up having a fairly positive view of Columbus. It certainly took a lot of nerve to, and a lot of entrepreneurship to raise the money to put his ships together and to go out, and they weren't sure they were going to fall off the end of the earth, and so it's quite fascinating. I think in my youth, he was a positive force, and it's rather interesting to me as an American and as a professor to see the all-out assault on Columbus, including the fact that I live near my University of St. Thomas campus. There was a statue in a public park of Columbus, and it was defaced so often that just before the COVID shutdown, early 2020, the statue has been permanently removed from the park. And I think that is a very sad commentary And of course, we've seen a lot of statues around the United States defaced and damaged, but it's interesting that it's gone back from to even Christopher Columbus, and I think it displays an extraordinary level of ignorance and misunderstanding of the past. Mary, we're running short on time. One of the things we try and do is keep these short so that people will actually watch them. That's actually one of our objectives, to share what you're talking about with our audience. Tell people, if they'd like some more information, what's the easiest way to get information from you?
Yes, well, thanks. Yeah, dissidentprof.com. You can, get my email address there, send me an email, get on my mailing list. I also have another site called marygrabar.com, Grabar, where I have links to the articles that I've published. So, I encourage everyone to get on my newsletter list. Be in touch with me that way. I will be posting, sending out notices about the book. It's going to be out September 7th. You can pre-order it through regnery.com or Amazon or any place else where books are being sold.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mary Grabar, for being on Saving America for this edition. Take good care.
Thank you.